Veteran's dog wouldn't stop barking in his $200 a haunted cabin. Then he found the hidden trapdoor. The wind cut through the pines like a whisper that didn't want to be heard. Ethan Cole tightened his grip on the steering wheel as his rusted pickup climbed the narrow mountain road. The sky had that cold blue tint that meant snow wasn't far off. After hours of silence, the sign finally appeared. Crow Hollow Road. He slowed, gravel crunching under the tires. At the end of the road sat the cabin he'd bought for $200. A tax sale miracle, the clerk had called it, but the locals used a different name, the Haunted Cabin. The last man who'd lived there vanished in the late 90s. No one bid when it went up for sale. Ethan hadn't cared. He wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for somewhere quiet enough to stop remembering. He parked by the old gate. The place looked smaller than in the courthouse photo. Grey pine walls bowed inward, roof sagging under the weight of the years. Smoke stains trailed above the stone chimney like old ghosts that hadn't left. Atlas jumped down from the truck bed, paws landing softly on frozen ground. His coat gleamed in the dull light, black and tan, thick around the shoulders. A retired military shepherd, same as his owner, both marked by service, both still half waiting for orders. "Here we are," Ethan said. His voice sounded foreign against the quiet. Atlas sniffed the air, tail low, posture alert. His ears flicked once toward the tree line. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and iron. Dust clung to the floorboards. A single chair sat by the stone fireplace, as if waiting. Ethan dropped his pack beside it, rubbed his temples, and exhaled. The silence pressed in. No generator hum, no voices, no radio static. Just wind and the creak of the roof shifting. He lit a small lamp, enough to paint the walls in amber. Atlas paced the perimeter, nose close to the baseboards, scanning. When he reached the hearth, he froze. "Atlas?" Ethan asked, half expecting him to relax. But the dog's body went rigid, tail stiff, head tilted. The fur along his spine rose. Then came the sound, low, guttural, rolling out of his chest like it came from somewhere deeper than lungs. It wasn't a bark, it was a warning. Ethan stood still, pulse quickening. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd didn't move. His eyes locked on the stone fireplace, just above the lower row of bricks. The air around them shifted, heavier, like pressure before an explosion. Ethan felt the old instinct flicker alive, the one drilled into him from patrols in Iraq. Freeze, observe, don't assume safety. He crouched beside the dog, resting a hand on his back. Muscles quivered under his palm, not in fear, but readiness. Atlas had gone still like this once before, seconds before an IED detonated outside Fallujah. That pause had saved them both. "Easy," Ethan whispered, eyes fixed on the hearth. The stones were cold, soot-stained, uneven. But as he leaned closer, the smell hit him, metallic, old, faintly chemical. Not the scent of a dead animal, something older. Atlas shifted his weight, a low growl rippling again. Ethan reached for the poker resting against the wall. He tapped one of the lower stones. A dull thud. He tapped the one beside it. Hollow. He froze. The dog's ears flicked forward, every line of his body pointing toward that single spot. The floorboards groaned behind them. Ethan spun, flashlight cutting across the room. Nothing but shadows. The wind pressed harder against the window panes, howling through the cracks. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. He'd survived ambushes, mortars, the chaos of cities torn apart, and now a piece of real estate was making his pulse race. Atlas barked once, sharp and deliberate. It startled him more than gunfire would have. The shepherd didn't bark without purpose. Ethan backed away from the fireplace and sat down heavily in the chair, heart pounding. He could still hear that hollow note echoing in his head. For a long minute neither of them moved. Finally he exhaled. Maybe this place really is haunted. Atlas turned his head toward him briefly, then back to the stones, unmoved by the joke. His breathing was slow, steady, soldier calm. Outside, snow began to fall, whispering against the roof. The wind shifted direction, carrying the faint scent of pine and something else, like burnt oil. Ethan rubbed his hands together, trying to shake the chill. "We'll deal with it in the morning," he said softly. But even as he spoke, he knew the dog wouldn't rest. Atlas lay down near the hearth, chin on his paws, eyes still open, watching. Ethan stared into the dark stone until the shapes blurred. The weight of silence pressed heavier, the kind that had followed him home from the desert. The silence that came after the noise stopped, but before the fear did. He tried to sleep, wrapped in his old field blanket, but the night didn't let him. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, he heard it again. Not the wind, not the creak of timber, a faint scrape from inside the wall. Atlas lifted his head instantly, eyes glowing amber in the dim light. The sound stopped. Then came another, softer, deliberate, stone brushing against stone. Ethan sat up, throat dry. Atlas was already on his feet, body angled toward the hearth. The fire wasn't lit, but the dog was staring at it as if something inside had moved. Ethan reached for the flashlight and slowly rose to his knees. He shined the beam across the floor and the fireplace bricks. The light caught a line he hadn't seen before, a faint, clean seam around one of the stones near the base. Perfectly rectangular. Too perfect for age. Atlas growled low again, the kind of sound that told Ethan exactly what he needed to know. Whatever was behind that stone, it wasn't nothing. He lowered the flashlight and looked at the dog. "All right, partner," he whispered. "Tomorrow we dig." But neither of them slept. The storm raged outside, and the old cabin, his $200 refuge, breathed quietly with them, holding its secret in the walls. And all through the night, Atlas never looked away from the hearth, guarding something he could sense but Ethan could not yet see. The snow kept falling through the night, blanketing the old roof and muffling every sound. By morning, the cabin felt sealed off from the world. Ethan sat at the table, sipping coffee that had gone cold, eyes fixed on the fireplace. Atlas was there again, lying low but awake, his gaze steady on the same patch of stone near the floor. "Still on it, huh?" Ethan muttered. The dog didn't move. He'd told himself 100 times it was nothing. Maybe a rodent nest, maybe his mind turning small noises into ghosts. But deep down, he knew better. That feeling in his gut wasn't imagination. It was the same one he'd had before every ambush, every explosion, every loss. Atlas had that same tension too, his body alert, yet calm, as if waiting for Ethan to catch up to whatever he already knew. Ethan pulled on his coat and went outside for air. The forest around Crow Hollow was quiet, unnaturally so. No birdsong, no rustle from the pines, just the distant hiss of wind rolling down from the ridge. He crouched, running a hand through the snow, trying to slow his pulse. "It's just a cabin," he told himself, but his own voice sounded hollow in the cold. He remembered when silence used to mean safety. Now it only meant something was watching. When he went back inside, Atlas hadn't moved an inch. The fire was still cold. Ethan crouched beside him. "You're really not letting this go, are you?" Atlas's ears twitched once. His eyes didn't blink. Ethan sighed and reached for the poker. He tapped the base of the hearth, once, twice, 3 times. Solid. He shifted slightly to the right and tapped again. The sound changed, a deeper, emptier thud. Hollow. The air thickened. Atlas rose, moving closer, nose almost touching the stone. He inhaled sharply and gave a low, rolling growl. Ethan froze, the poker still pressed against the wall. That sound, the hollow vibration under the metal, hit him in the chest like déjà vu. He was no longer in Idaho. He was back in Iraq, sweating under a dead sun, the taste of sand in his mouth. He could smell the diesel, the rot, the fear. And he could see Atlas then, younger, leaner, ears pricked forward, paw raised mid-step. The street ahead looked empty until Ethan caught the faintest glint under a piece of tin. Wires. Pressure plate. One step more and they would have been gone. He remembered how the shepherd had sat down right there in the road, calm as stone, eyes on him like he was giving an order. Ethan had frozen too. The bomb tech found the trigger minutes later. That calm had saved 3 lives. The same calm was in Atlas now. Ethan dropped the poker and sat, back on his heels. "Okay," he whispered. "I hear you." Atlas tilted his head, tail low but not tucked. His breathing slowed. It was the signal Ethan had learned to trust, not panic, awareness. He grabbed his flashlight and crouched by the hearth. The seam was still there, faint but too perfect. He pressed his fingers against the mortar. Cold, smooth. He knocked again. The hollow sound came from behind the 3rd stone from the bottom, the one Atlas had been staring at. Ethan pressed harder. The edge shifted just enough for dust to fall. He drew back. Something about the way it gave felt deliberate, like a panel meant to open but sealed again. He glanced at Atlas. "You found something, didn't you, boy?" The shepherd stepped closer, sniffed once, and sat down, right in front of the stone. The same position as that day on patrol. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "All right. Tomorrow we open it. Daylight. I'm not starting a ghost story at midnight." Atlas didn't move. He just kept watching. That night, Ethan tried to ignore the itch crawling up his spine. He lit a small fire, but it did little to warm the unease. Every flicker of flame made the shadows dance across the walls, and every creak of timber sounded like footsteps on the porch. He turned on the radio he'd found in a box, hoping for local weather. Only static. He turned the knob slowly. For a brief second, between the bursts of white noise, a faint voice cut through. They found the bodies near the old creek line, same valley. Then silence. Ethan froze. He adjusted the dial again, but it was gone. He looked at Atlas. The dog's ears had lifted. "You heard it too?" A gust hit the windows hard. The fire wavered. For a few long minutes they sat there, man and dog, both staring at the same wall, the same line of stone that had started to haunt them. Ethan tried to shake it off, muttering, "Coincidence?" But the word felt weak, even to him. At some point near dawn, he dozed off in the chair. When he woke, Atlas was gone. Panic jolted through him. He grabbed the flashlight and scanned the room. The door was still bolted. Then he saw him. By the fireplace again, front paw scraping at the stone, claws clinking against mortar. Not frantic, but methodical. "Atlas!" Ethan said, voice sharp. The dog froze, turned his head slightly, then went right back to work. Dust drifted into the air. Ethan crouched beside him. The scratch marks lined up perfectly with the outline he'd seen before. He reached out, brushed away the loose grit, and there it was. A fine crack running along the base, forming a rectangle just large enough for a small hatch. Ethan leaned back on his heels. His pulse kicked. "You're kidding me," he whispered. Atlas let out one short bark, deep and certain. Ethan stared at the dog, then at the stone, then back at the dog again. He felt the same mixture of awe and dread he'd felt years ago when he'd realized his partner wasn't guessing. He was right. He stood, grabbed the crowbar leaning near the door, and knelt again. "Okay, partner," he murmured. Let's see what you found. He wedged the metal into the crack and pressed. The mortar groaned but didn't give. He changed angles, pushed harder. A brittle pop echoed through the cabin, sharp as gunfire. The stone shifted a fraction of an inch. Atlas stepped back, eyes fixed, ears forward. Ethan stopped, breathing hard. A faint draft slipped out from the gap, cold and dry, carrying the smell of earth and something else. Oil, maybe, or decay. He glanced at Atlas. The shepherd didn't growl this time, he simply waited. Ethan pulled the bar free, heart hammering. He wanted to keep going, to rip the stone open and see what was underneath. But something in the air told him to stop. Not fear, instinct, the same kind the dog had. He replaced the bar against the wall, brushed the dust off his hands and whispered, "Tomorrow, we do this right." Atlas didn't relax. He lay down again, still facing the hearth, eyes open, the old soldier back on watch. Ethan turned off the light and sat beside him, the two of them framed in the faint orange glow of dying embers. Outside, the forest was utterly still. Inside, a single hollow thud echoed quietly from the wall, like a heartbeat waiting to be uncovered. Ethan looked down at the dog, his voice barely audible. "Whatever's in there, we'll face it together." Atlas blinked once, slow, steady, and kept his eyes on the stone. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting for Ethan to follow his lead, just like he always had. Morning came pale and quiet. The sky hung low and grey over the ridge. Frost glazed the window glass, turning the view outside into a blur of white and pine. Ethan hadn't really slept. He sat on the floor near the hearth, coffee untouched, watching Atlas pace back and forth, nails clicking against the old wood. The shepherd kept circling to the same spot, front paws scraping near the base of the fireplace, nose pressed tight to the seam Ethan had found the night before. Each time Ethan tried to call him off, Atlas ignored him, eyes locked, ears forward. There was no barking this time, just silent, determined focus. "All right," Ethan muttered. "You win." He grabbed the crowbar again, crouching beside the hearth. The stone was cold to the touch, slick with condensation. He wedged the bar into the hairline crack and leaned his weight into it. The sound that came back was wrong for stone, a dull, compressed groan that spoke of something hollow behind it. Atlas stood close, one paw lifting slightly, tail still. He wasn't just watching, he was guiding. "Easy," Ethan whispered, more to himself than to the dog. He pried harder. The edge of the stone shifted with a brittle snap, and a chunk of mortar fell away, scattering dust across the floor. Then Atlas moved in. The dog's front paws dug at the loosened edge, claws chipping away bits of old plaster. He worked like a machine, low growls rumbling from his chest, as if urging the wall to give up its secret. One last shove from Ethan's crowbar, and the stone slab came free, falling forward with a heavy thud that echoed through the cabin. Behind it was a cavity no bigger than a suitcase, lined with rough cement that looked newer than the rest of the fireplace. The air that poured out was cold, stale, and smelled faintly of rust. Ethan raised the flashlight. The beam caught on something metallic, an olive-green steel box, dented at the corners, its hinges corroded but intact. He reached in carefully, hands brushing against cobwebs and grit. When he dragged it out, the weight surprised him. Inside, something shifted, solid and uneven. The box was stamped with old military lettering. "Property of U.S. Corps of Engineers." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. "What the hell?" Atlas sniffed the box and sat down beside it, head tilted. Ethan smiled faintly. "Guess it's not a ghost after all." He set the box on the table, scraped the rusted latch open with the crowbar, and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a decaying tarp, were 3 small leather-bound notebooks, and a sealed plastic pouch full of papers. On the inside cover of the first notebook, written in neat block letters, was a name: M. Harris. Ethan frowned. The name rang no bell, but something about the precise handwriting, the engineer's neatness, it felt official. He flipped through the first few pages. Notes about rainfall, wildlife counts, mineral readings. Nothing unusual. Then, halfway through, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew uneven. Words scrawled at the margins. Unauthorized disposal. Test wells failing. Dead wildlife within 5-mile radius. He stopped at one line written darker than the rest, as though the pen had pressed deep into the paper. They said the water's clean, but the deer die, foaming. Ethan stared at the sentence until the words blurred. Atlas gave a quiet whine, sensing the change in his breathing. He looked up at the dog. "You found this?" he said softly. Atlas tilted his head, eyes steady, unblinking. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment, how the cabin wasn't just a hiding place anymore, it was a witness. He went through the other notebooks. The same handwriting, but more frantic. References to test samples hidden under stone seal, and coordinates scribbled beside the words, TerraCore Energy. The last entry stopped mid-sentence. They know I talked to the sheriff. If I don't make it out... The rest was a jagged line across the page, ink smeared. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the eaves. Ethan's stomach tightened. He'd heard of TerraCore, a mining company that went bankrupt after a lawsuit over water contamination somewhere north of here. He thought it was just rumor. But this was physical proof someone had tried to cover something up. Atlas barked once, short and sharp. Ethan turned. The dog stood by the window, tail stiff, nose pointed towards the tree line. The hairs on his neck were raised. Ethan joined him, peering out through the frost-streaked glass. Nothing moved, just snow drifting down in slow spirals. Then he caught it, faint tire tracks cutting across the lower trail. Fresh. He stepped back, grabbed his jacket, and reached for the pistol he kept holstered at the table. His old instincts clicked in. He hadn't seen another person since arriving here. Whoever was out there didn't belong. Atlas followed him to the door, body low, quiet as shadow. Ethan unlatched the lock, cracked the door open, and listened. The only sound was the slow drip of melting snow from the roof. Then, somewhere beyond the pines, the faint crunch of footsteps fading away. He closed the door again, securing it tight. When he turned back, Atlas was sitting by the open steel box, eyes fixed on it, as if guarding the secret they'd just uncovered. Ethan crouched beside him, resting a hand on the dog's back. The warmth under his palm steadied him. "You did good, partner," he murmured. "You always do." He gathered the notebooks and sealed them in a dry bag, tucking them inside his rucksack. Whatever Harris had found here, people had died to hide it. And now Ethan had it sitting on his table. Atlas finally relaxed enough to lie down, though his gaze stayed trained on the window. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. Ethan built a fire, the glow filling the small cabin with a fragile kind of comfort. He sat on the floor beside Atlas, reading the last few pages of Harris's notes again. There were coordinates, numbers that pointed to a site a few miles north, near an abandoned quarry. And at the bottom of the page, one more chilling line written in uneven scrawl. If you're reading this, it means they didn't stop. The ground is still breathing. Ethan looked up from the page. Atlas was watching him, eyes gleaming in the firelight. He whispered, "What did we just step into, boy?" Outside, somewhere in the distance, an engine started, echoing faintly through the valley. Atlas's ears twitched, and that low growl returned. The one that meant danger wasn't a memory. It was close. Ethan stood, moving to the window, heart pounding. Headlights flickered once between the trees and vanished. He glanced at the box on the table, then at his partner. Looks like we're not alone in this. Atlas rose, shoulders squared, waiting for his command. The same soldier's stance he'd taken years ago before a firefight. Ethan blew out the lamp, letting the cabin fall into shadow. We stay quiet, he whispered. We see who comes looking. Atlas didn't bark. He didn't need to. The way he stood, still as stone, said it all. Whatever haunted Crow Hollow cabin wasn't supernatural. It was human. And it had just realized the truth had been found. By the third day, the snow around the cabin had turned to ice. Every step outside cracked like breaking glass. Ethan sat at the old kitchen table, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, reading through Harris's journals for the 5th time. The pages smelled of damp leather and old oil. Atlas lay near the door, ears twitching with every gust of wind. The more Ethan read, the colder he felt. The entries weren't rambling notes anymore. They were reports, precise, dated, deliberate. Terracore energy, he muttered under his breath. The name was written again and again across the pages, often beside numbers, coordinates, and sample data. One line stopped him cold. Soil saturation above federal limit. Orders from Sheriff Donnelly to halt testing. Payment delivered. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Sheriff Donnelly, the same man who'd been in charge of this county for decades. Ethan had seen his name on a faded campaign poster in town, grinning in front of the courthouse. Atlas lifted his head, watching him carefully. Ethan spoke quietly, as if thinking aloud. You remember that guy at the gas station? The one who stared when we bought supplies? That was him. The dog blinked, eyes calm but alert. He turned another page. A hand-drawn map marked 3 burial sites along the ridgeline, each labeled with chemical symbols Ethan recognized from his time working construction after the Marines. Industrial solvents, heavy metals, stuff that could poison the water table for generations. Then a paragraph in shaky handwriting. The deer collapse near the stream. Their tongues foam white. Donnelly says it's disease, but the water tastes of iron and acid. Ethan ran his fingers over the ink. The words were desperate, human. He could picture Harris, a man with a conscience, probably thinking the truth would protect him. It hadn't. He turned to the last page. The handwriting trailed off mid-sentence. Dried mud smeared across the edge. Harris had never finished the entry. A knock shattered the silence. Ethan froze. Atlas was on his feet before he could stand, a low growl vibrating through the floorboards. Another knock followed, heavier this time. "Mr. Cole?" A voice called. "Sheriff's Department." Ethan's pulse jumped. He shoved the notebooks under a loose floorboard near the table, kicked the rug over them, and gestured for Atlas to stay. The dog didn't move from his guard position. He opened the door just enough to see the man standing outside. Sheriff Donnelly looked like the poster version of authority, broad-shouldered, late 50s, thick mustache turning grey. His jacket was buttoned too tight over his holster, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," Donnelly said. "Mind if I step in? Heard you bought the Crow Hollow property. Just wanted to make sure everything's in order. Folks say this cabin's a death trap." Ethan hesitated, then stepped aside. "It's holding together fine." The sheriff entered, wiping his boots on the mat. His gaze swept the room once, casual on the surface, but too slow to be innocent. He took in the table, the half-empty coffee cup, the faint scuffs on the floor. Then his eyes settled on Atlas, who stood by the fireplace, muscles taut, tail still. "Big dog," Donnelly said. "Partner," Ethan replied. Donnelly smiled thinly. "You military?" "Used to be. Figures. Got that look. Quiet, suspicious. The sheriff chuckled, though his eyes stayed sharp. You hear anything strange out here at night? Locals say this place is haunted. Ethan folded his arms. Just the wind. Donnelly's gaze drifted to the hearth. He took a step closer, brushing his hand against the edge of the stone. Interesting spot for a dog to camp out, he said softly. Atlas didn't move, but the growl started again, low and controlled. Ethan felt it in his chest like thunder waiting to break. He's protective, he said. I can see that. Donnelly straightened, his tone turning lighter. Anyway, like I said, just checking in. We had a break-in at a ranger station down the valley last night. Some old files went missing. Thought I'd make sure you hadn't seen anyone snooping around. Ethan forced a neutral smile. Haven't seen a soul. Donnelly nodded slowly, as if weighing the words. Then his eyes flicked toward the window. You keep to yourself out here, Mr. Cole. Sometimes that's safer. It wasn't advice. It was a warning. He tipped his hat and walked out into the cold. Ethan waited until the crunch of boots faded down the trail before exhaling. Atlas finally relaxed, moving closer to him. Ethan crouched, rubbing the dog's neck. He knew. He whispered, He knows something's in here. Atlas's eyes followed the door, his body still tense. Ethan went back to the table and pulled out the notebooks again. The sheriff's name stared up at him from the pages like a curse. He grabbed a pencil and circled every mention of Donnelly, tracing the pattern. The entries showed payment dates lining up with TerraCore's waste shipments. The final note had coordinates, right near where the quarry was supposed to be. He knew what this meant. Harris hadn't just documented contamination. He'd uncovered a crime. And Donnelly had buried it. Literally. Ethan stood and paced the room, thinking. He needed proof, not just journals. If TerraCore dumped toxic waste up there, traces would still be in the soil or water. Maybe that was what Harris had been trying to expose before he disappeared. Atlas nudged his leg, breaking his spiral of thought. The dog went to the door and scratched once, then looked back. You want to go out? Ethan asked. Atlas barked once, then turned toward the trail leading north, the direction of the ridge Harris had drawn on the map. Ethan looked at the notebooks, then at the dog. You think that's where he went? The shepherd stood still, eyes locked on the distant line of trees, snow swirling around his face. Yeah, Ethan said quietly. Me too. They set out an hour later. The forest was silent except for their boots crunching through snow. The world had the same stillness it did before an ambush. Too quiet, too heavy. Ethan's mind drifted back to patrol days, to the weight of responsibility, to trusting his dog more than the men with rifles behind him. He remembered one night near Fallujah, when Atlas stopped dead in the middle of a road. Everyone else kept moving. Ethan stayed with the dog. Seconds later, the world exploded. Atlas had taken shrapnel that night, still bore the scar. He'd saved Ethan's life without hesitation. Now, years later, in a frozen forest in Idaho, that same instinct was leading them toward another kind of battlefield. By dusk, they reached the ridge. The wind carried a strange metallic tang, faint but unmistakable. Ethan knelt, scooped up a handful of snow, and sniffed. It smelled wrong, like burnt plastic and something acrid underneath. Atlas barked once, sharp. He was staring at a small stream trickling out from under the rocks. The edges of the water were crusted in white foam, even though it hadn't frozen. Ethan touched it with his glove, and the fabric hissed faintly, eaten away by something invisible. His throat tightened. The words from the journal echoed in his mind. They said the water's clean, but the deer die foaming. He looked down at his dog, who was watching him, waiting for command. You were right again, partner, Ethan said, And this time, we're going to finish what Harris started. As they turned back toward the cabin, headlights flickered far down the trail. Someone else was coming up the mountain. Atlas stiffened, a low growl rolling deep in his chest. Ethan whispered, "We've got company." And for the first time since the war, the old feeling came back, the certainty that survival meant trusting the dog, not the law. The sky had cleared by morning, but the air carried a sharpness that bit through Ethan's coat. He sat at the table, Harris's notebook spread out under the weak light, his phone balanced on the edge. The signal flickered in and out, but he managed to capture each page, frame by frame, every note and coordinate. When the last photo sent, the name on his screen read, Riley Tran, an old friend from his Marine days, now an investigative reporter in Seattle. Riley picked up after a few rings. "Jesus, Ethan, it's been years. What's going on?" Ethan hesitated. "I found something in that cabin. A man's notes, evidence of chemical dumping. TerraCore Energy." TerraCore. Riley's tone changed instantly. "That's the company the EPA buried years ago. Are you saying there's proof?" "There's more than proof. There's a graveyard of steel drums under this mountain. I'm standing on it." Static filled the line for a moment. "Ethan, listen. That company's tied to half the county's leadership. If you've got evidence, they'll come for it, and for you. Get it out of there." "I already sent copies," Ethan said, "but something tells me it's not all in the papers." He hung up before she could argue, and looked down at Atlas, who was standing by the hearth again, pawing at the floorboards near the wall. "What is it, boy?" Atlas scratched harder, nose pressed to the seams of the wooden planks. When Ethan crouched down, he felt it, the faint vibration underfoot, a hollow echo where solid ground should be. He pried up one of the boards. Beneath it, a thin layer of ice crusted over a concrete slab. It wasn't part of the cabin's foundation. He fetched the crowbar and chipped away the frost. Atlas barked once, sharp and certain, as if to say, "You're close." The slab gave way to a rusted hatch about 3 feet wide, sealed with a corroded steel handle. Ethan's stomach knotted. "This is what you've been hearing, huh?" Atlas wagged his tail once, the only movement breaking the still air. He wedged the bar into the handle and pulled. The metal shrieked, sending flakes of rust into the air. A wave of frozen air rushed up from below, heavy with a chemical tang that burned the back of his throat. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and leaned over the opening. A narrow tunnel sloped down into darkness. Walls lined with concrete, a ladder bolted to one side, the bottom lost in shadow. He looked at Atlas. "Stay," he ordered softly. But the shepherd refused, planting himself at the edge, eyes locked on his owner. "Fine. Together, then." He climbed down slowly, boots hitting each rung with a hollow clang. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the stench of oil and decay. When he reached the bottom, his flashlight caught the faint glint of metal. Rows of steel drums stretched into the dark, each marked with faded red labels. TerraCore Energy, industrial waste. Atlas descended halfway, paws steady on the ladder, then jumped down beside him, sniffing the air. The dog sneezed and turned his head, whining softly. Ethan covered his mouth with his sleeve and crouched near one of the drums. The label was peeling, but the date was clear, 1999. A line of stamped text read, "Corrosive materials, hazardous to groundwater." He ran his hand across the surface. The metal was warm, almost humming beneath his palm. "They're leaking," he whispered. Atlas barked again, louder this time, the sound echoing down the concrete corridor. Something shifted in the dark. Ethan swung the light to the far end of the tunnel. The beam caught a low doorway, its frame buried under ice. He moved closer, heart hammering. There was a sign welded crookedly to the door. Restricted. Site B. Atlas's growl deepened. The dog's nose pressed to the seam. Ethan knelt beside him, shining the light lower. Through a crack at the bottom, a faint vapor seeped out, hissing where it touched the ice. The smell hit him again. Sharp, chemical, wrong. He staggered back, coughing. God, they dumped it right into the ground! Atlas turned toward him, ears twitching, as if urging him to move. They climbed out of the shaft one at a time, both gasping when the clean air hit their lungs. Ethan slammed the hatch shut and dropped to the floor, chest heaving. Atlas stood over him, tail low, eyes sharp, his breath fogging in the cold. Ethan leaned against the wall, staring at the hatch. "It's real," he whispered. "All of it. Harris was right." He pulled his phone from his pocket, hands shaking, and snapped pictures of the drums, the hatch, the warning sign. Then he sent them to Riley with one line. They buried poison under Crow Hollow. The message sent. He waited for the signal to die again. Atlas settled beside him, pressing his body close. The dog's heartbeat was steady, grounding. Ethan stroked his fur, whispering, "You always know where the truth hides, don't you?" Outside, the wind howled, sweeping down the valley like a warning. From the distance came a sound he hadn't heard in days, the crunch of tires on frozen gravel. Ethan froze, eyes meeting Atlas's. The dog's ears pricked, body tensing. Someone was coming up the trail. The night came colder than usual, the kind of cold that warned of something breaking. Ethan had finished sealing the hatch beneath the cabin and sent the last of the photos to Riley before the signal died again. The message went through with only 2 words attached. "If anything happens." He sat by the table, listening to the fire crackle in the stove. Atlas was lying near the door, head on his paws, but his eyes weren't resting. Every few minutes, his ears flicked toward the window, tracking something Ethan couldn't hear. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered. "It's just the wind." But it wasn't. A faint crunch echoed outside, the sound of boots on frozen ground. Atlas's head snapped up. Another sound followed, closer this time, deliberate. Not random. Someone was moving around the cabin. Ethan killed the lantern, plunging the room into shadow. The firelight flickered across the dog's face. Atlas was standing now, muscles drawn tight, a low growl humming in his chest. Ethan reached for the handgun on the table. He cocked it silently and whispered, "Stay behind me." The window shattered. A bottle wrapped in cloth came spinning through the air, trailing a streak of fire. It hit the wall and exploded into a sheet of flames. Another one followed, then another. The cabin filled with the roar of burning alcohol. Ethan dove for the floor, dragging Atlas with him. Heat rushed across the room. Through the blur of smoke, he saw shapes moving outside. 3, maybe 4 men in dark coats and masks. They were throwing more Molotovs, aiming to burn everything that held the truth. He crawled to the table, grabbed his phone, and shoved it into his pocket. "Move!" he shouted. Atlas bolted towards the window, barking with the fury of a storm. The men outside hesitated. For half a second, that was all it took for Ethan to fire through the shattered glass. One of them fell. The others ducked behind the truck parked near the trail. Flames crawled up the curtains. The smell of kerosene filled the air. Ethan's lungs burned. Atlas ran to the back door, barking sharply. There was no time left. The roof groaned as the heat reached the beams. They burst through the door into the snow. The cold slapped them both in the face, steam rising from Ethan's coat. The cabin behind them roared, the orange light painting the snowfield like daylight. Ethan turned back once, long enough to see the place collapsing inward, years of secrets turning to ash. A gunshot cracked from the woods. The bullet tore into the snow beside him. Atlas spun, barked once, then sprinted toward the sound. "Atlas, no!" Ethan shouted, but the dog was already gone, vanishing into the dark. Ethan dropped behind a log, heart hammering, trying to see through the smoke. Another gunshot, closer this time. Then silence. For a heartbeat he thought he'd lost him. Then came the sound, a snarl, a cry, and the heavy thud of struggle. A man stumbled out of the dark, clutching his arm, blood soaking through his sleeve. Atlas followed, dragging at the man's coat, teeth locked, eyes blazing. "Atlas, back!" Ethan shouted. The shepherd released, stepping back to stand between his master and the attacker. The man stumbled away, slipping into the trees. Headlights flicked on down the road, then disappeared into the valley. Ethan's vision blurred from the heat and smoke. He turned toward the cabin. The roof gave a final groan before collapsing completely. Fire devoured the walls, sparks rising into the night sky. The air smelled of burning wood and diesel. Atlas limped back to him, fur singed, blood streaking his flank. Ethan dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around the dog. "You're okay," he murmured. "You're okay, buddy." Atlas's breathing was ragged but steady. His tail twitched once. The snow beneath them turned pink, where drops of blood melted through. Ethan tore a piece of cloth from his sleeve and pressed it against the wound along the dog's ribs. Atlas didn't whimper, just leaned into him, eyes half closed but unbroken. For a moment there was no sound except the hiss of fire meeting snow. The cabin that had kept their secret was now nothing but a column of flame. The evidence, the notebooks, the buried truth, all gone. Ethan stared into the blaze. His hands shook, not from cold but from anger. "They think they erased it," he said, voice raw. "But it's already out there." The phone in his pocket vibrated once. A message from Riley flashed on the cracked screen. "Got the files. They're real. Sending backup." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We did it," he whispered. He looked down at Atlas, whose head rested against his knee. "You saved me again." The dog's eyes flickered, open, reflecting the firelight like amber glass. They sat there together, man and dog, surrounded by the falling snow and the soft crackle of a burning past. When the roof finally caved in with a thunderous crash, a wave of embers rose into the sky, swirling against the darkness like stars trying to escape the earth. Ethan stood, cradling Atlas in his arms. The dog's weight was heavy, real, alive. Behind them, the cabin burned until the night swallowed it whole, leaving only the smell of smoke, the bite of frost, and the echo of a promise that the truth, once freed, could never be buried again. The fire burned through the night, a torch against the white spine of the Idaho mountains. By dawn, only the chimney remained standing, a blackened pillar rising from a field of ash and ice. Ethan and Atlas waited on the ridge above the ruin, both hollowed by exhaustion, both still alive. The first sound came from the sky, the low thump of helicopter rotors slicing the cold air. Then another. The storm clouds broke as the convoy appeared over the valley, 3 federal choppers flanked by smaller surveillance drones. The snow swirled under their descent like a rising tide. Ethan shielded his eyes as the first helicopter landed near the creek bed. Men and women in tactical gear poured out, followed by agents in blue EPA jackets. The insignia of the Department of Justice flashed in the sunlight. At the front of the group was Riley Tran. Her parka hood was down, dark hair whipping in the wind, eyes locked on Ethan. She ran the last stretch on foot, breath fogging in the cold. "You're out of your damn mind," she said when she reached him. But her voice cracked halfway through the sentence, relief softening the anger. "You sent the files just in time. They're real, Ethan. Every bit of it." Ethan managed a faint smile. "Guess I picked the right friend to haunt with bad news." Riley exhaled, shaking her head. "You picked the right one to believe you." Behind her, agents began securing the site. Hazmat suits moved like pale ghosts among the wreckage, sealing drums, marking coordinates, digging up evidence before the fire could erase it all. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and fuel. Atlas stood beside Ethan, his left flank wrapped in a makeshift bandage. The fur around it was scorched, but his posture was straight, his gaze unwavering. When one of the agents tried to approach, Atlas stepped in front of Ethan, still guarding. "It's okay, boy," Ethan murmured. The dog hesitated, then sat down beside him, breath steady despite the pain. Riley crouched to his level. "He's something else," she whispered. "They should make statues of dogs like this." Ethan looked down at Atlas and shook his head. "He doesn't need a statue. He just needs peace." A shout echoed from below. A group of federal marshals were escorting someone out of a dark SUV parked near the tree line. Sheriff Donnelly stumbled forward, hands cuffed, face pale under the winter light. His hat was gone, his hair matted with sweat. He saw Ethan immediately. For a long moment, the two men just stared across the distance, the one who buried the truth and the one who dug it back up. Donnelly's lips moved, maybe to protest, maybe to curse, but no sound came out. The marshals pulled him toward another vehicle. Riley spoke quietly. "They found bank transfers, offshore accounts, his name's on every TerraCorp payout since 2001. The EPA director's ordering a statewide probe. You didn't just expose one man, you blew open an entire system." Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the place where the cabin had stood. An EPA agent approached, a woman in her 40s with soot smudged on her gloves. "Mr. Cole?" she asked. "We found traces of arsenic, benzene, and lead near the old well line. The contamination runs deep, but with this data—" She paused, holding up a scorched USB drive sealed in a bag. "It's enough to prove criminal negligence." Ethan nodded. That's all Harris wanted. Harris. The man who wrote the journals, the one they buried down there before me. The agent's expression softened. "Then you did right by him." She glanced at Atlas. "Your dog just saved a town, Mr. Cole." Ethan looked at the shepherd beside him, his coat still smoking faintly in the cold. "He's been saving lives long before this," he said quietly. A gust of wind carried the last of the ash into the sky. The sound of camera shutters began in the distance, press crews arriving from the nearest city. Drones circled overhead, capturing the scene that would soon flash across every national network. But none of that mattered to Ethan. He knelt beside Atlas, placing a hand on the dog's head. "You did good, partner. It's over." Atlas pressed his nose against Ethan's hand, tail flicking once, as if acknowledging the words but not quite believing them. Riley joined them, crouching low. "You should come back with me," she said. "Seattle's got hospitals for both of you, and when this goes public, you'll need protection." Ethan's eyes stayed on the smoldering remains of the cabin. "We'll come down soon, but not yet." He stood, watching as federal trucks rolled into the valley, as men in suits exchanged clipped orders through radios. Sheriff Donnelly was gone now, swallowed by the convoy heading west. The mountains felt quieter for it. Riley squeezed Ethan's arm before walking back towards the chopper. "I'll see you in a few days. Try not to burn anything else down." When she left, Ethan turned to Atlas. The dog was staring out at the forest, ears pricked. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I feel it too. The ghosts are finally quiet." They stood there until the noise of engines faded, leaving only the whisper of wind across the snow. The sun was climbing over the ridge, turning the valley gold. Atlas limped forward, paw prints marking a trail through the ash. Ethan followed, each step a slow reclaiming of ground once lost. Somewhere below, the poisoned stream glinted faintly in the light. Soon it would be cleaned. Soon, the land would heal. Ethan reached down, brushing his hand across Atlas's fur. The dog tilted his head up, eyes clear and bright again. "You brought us home," Ethan said. Atlas didn't bark, didn't move. He just watched the horizon, standing guard as the first full light of morning broke over Crow Hollow. Spring came late to Crow Hollow. The snow melted in patches, revealing black earth and the faint shimmer of green beneath. Ethan worked in silence, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, hammering new beams into place where the old cabin once stood. The scent of sawdust mixed with pine filled the valley, replacing the bitter smell of smoke that had lingered for months. He hadn't built it to look pretty. The new cabin was smaller, solid and honest. Cedar frame, tin roof, stone hearth. He built it by hand, one plank at a time, the way his father once taught him. Every nail driven was a memory sealed. Every board a quiet apology to what was lost. Atlas watched from the porch, his body stronger now, though a faint scar still ran along his flank where the fire had burned him. Each morning he'd lie by the front step, head on his paws, eyes turned toward the forest where everything had begun. Sometimes he'd let out a single bark at dawn, not out of fear, but as if checking that the world was still safe. The town changed too. The cleanup crews came first, EPA, contractors, scientists in white suits moving through the woods like ghosts. They dug up the poisoned ground, drained the contaminated streams, and sealed the leaking drums that had slept under the earth for decades. Then came the reporters, the protests, the lawsuits. For a few months, Crow Hollow was on every news channel in the country, but when the headlines faded, the land remained. Ethan stayed. He didn't want fame or money. He wanted quiet and a place for Atlas to rest. Riley called often, sending updates from Seattle. TerraCore's executives flipped on each other. She'd said in one call, "Donnelly's trial's set for next month. You'll be called to testify." Ethan had sighed. "I'll be there. Just tell them the truth. Harris found it first." She paused on the line. "He would have liked that you finished what he started." Now, months later, the forest was healing. The water near the ridge ran clear again, the soil soft and sweet with new growth. Deer tracks returned to the stream bed. The ghosts of the poisoned valley were fading, replaced by the rhythm of life reclaiming what men had nearly killed. One morning, Ethan stepped outside with his coffee. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue streaked with thin clouds. Atlas lifted his head from the porch and watched as Ethan walked to the edge of the trail. There, beside the gravel road, stood a small wooden sign. The paint was new, the letters carved deep and even. Canine Ridge, in honor of Atlas, who never stopped guarding the truth. Ethan had argued against it when the county first proposed the idea. "He doesn't need a memorial," he'd said. But the locals insisted. They remembered the story. The veteran and his dog, the fire, the buried poison. It had become a legend in the valley, the kind people told their kids at night when they wanted to remind them that courage doesn't always come with a uniform or a gun. Ethan traced the carved letters with his fingertips. The wood was still rough, but it would weather well. "Guess you've got your name in stone now, huh?" he said. Atlas tilted his head, tail sweeping the porch once in quiet acknowledgement. The sound of tires approached, a pickup rolling slowly up the dirt road. Riley climbed out, wearing jeans and a flannel jacket, a rare smile on her face. "You weren't kidding," she said, looking around. "You actually rebuilt it." "Couldn't leave it as ashes," Ethan said. "Didn't feel right." She walked to the porch and crouched beside Atlas. "Hey, hero, you still keeping him in line?" Atlas huffed softly, leaning into her hand. Riley straightened, eyes scanning the horizon. "The EPA report came out yesterday. You were right. The contamination spread almost 2 counties over. But it's contained now. People can drink from their wells again. Ethan nodded. That's good enough for me. You could have left, she said. You could have sold the land, moved anywhere. He looked out toward the forest. After everything buried here? No, someone has to remember. That's what this place needed, a witness who won't look away. Riley smiled faintly. And Atlas? Ethan glanced down at the shepherd. He's the one doing the remembering. I'm just his shadow. The wind stirred through the trees. Sunlight spilled over the ridge, catching on the tin roof of the cabin. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something close to peace. Riley lingered a while, talking about Seattle, about future stories to chase. When she left, she gave Atlas a final scratch behind the ear. You take care of him, she said. Atlas barked once, a short shore sound. Ethan watched the truck disappear down the road. Then he turned back to the porch, sat beside his dog, and listened. The forest was alive with sound again. Birds, the ripple of a creek, the rustle of pine needles. He could almost hear the land breathe. You know, he said quietly, I think Harris would have liked this. Not the fire, not the headlines, but this, the silence afterward, the kind that means the earth's healing. Atlas pressed closer, head resting against Ethan's leg. They stayed that way as the day warmed, man and dog framed by the hum of rebirth around them. The scars would never fully fade, but maybe they weren't supposed to. Maybe they were reminders, proof that some fights were worth the cost. When dusk came, the light turned gold across the valley. Atlas stood, stretching, then settled once more at the porch's edge, his gaze fixed on the tree line. Ethan watched him for a moment, then nodded to himself. He's still guarding, Riley had said before she left. And it was true. Every morning, Atlas kept watch over Crow Hollow, over the place where truth had once been buried under stone and fear. And every evening, when the sky went red and the cold returned, Ethan would see him there, still, silent, unbroken. A soldier at rest, guarding not a battlefield, but a home. The autumn wind swept through Crow Hollow, carrying the scent of cedar and ash. The rebuilt cabin stood steady against the backdrop of gold and crimson trees. The seasons had turned, and so had Ethan's life. He no longer woke to the echoes of gunfire in his dreams or flinched at the creak of old wood. The silence that once felt unbearable had become a kind of peace. A truck climbed the dirt road that morning, tires crunching over gravel. Ethan looked up from chopping firewood as a young man stepped out, barely 20, thin frame, camera bag slung over his shoulder. Mr. Cole, the kid called, hesitant but excited. I'm Jonah. I'm from Boise State. I emailed you last month about the interview. Veterans and the truth they guard. You said I could come by today? Ethan nodded. You made good time. Roads get tricky this season. He gestured toward the porch. Come on, let's get you warm. Jonah followed, wide-eyed as he took in the cabin. The rebuilt structure still bore marks of hand tools, uneven in places, but strong. On the mantel above the stone hearth hung 2 photographs, one of Ethan and his unit overseas, the other of Atlas in his service vest, eyes bright under desert light. Atlas himself lay beside the fire now, older, heavier, his muzzle dusted with grey. He stirred when the visitor entered, giving a single quiet bark before resting his head again. He's bigger than he looked in the articles, Jonah said with a grin. Cameras lie, Ethan replied, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. They make everything smaller except the noise. They sat at the table. Jonah opened his notebook, a little awkward but sincere. I've read all the reports, what you uncovered, the contamination, the trial, but none of that's what I wanted to ask about. Then what's the story you're after? Ethan asked. Jonah hesitated. I guess. I want to know what it felt like. Everyone keeps calling it a haunted cabin. Was it really haunted? Ethan leaned back, eyes drifting towards the window. The forest outside shimmered in afternoon light. Not by ghosts, he said after a pause. By guilt. Jonah frowned, unsure. Whose guilt? Ethan's gaze lowered to his hands, rough and scarred. All of ours. The people who looked away. The ones who followed orders. The men who buried poison and called. It progressed. Even me, for trying to run from everything I'd seen instead of facing it. The fire popped softly. Atlas stirred, letting out a slow breath, the sound deep and steady. Ethan smiled faintly. He never let me run too far. Every time I tried, he'd bark. Drag me back. Guess he knew the truth before I did. Jonah scribbled notes quickly, glancing at the dog. Is he still guarding? Ethan chuckled. Always, even now. Though these days it's mostly chipmunks he's worried about. They both laughed. Then Jonah grew serious again. When you found the files, when you realized what was buried under this place, didn't you ever want to walk away? Just forget? Ethan took a long sip of coffee before answering. Every day. But once you've carried truth that heavy, you can't drop it without crushing someone else beneath it. The hardest part isn't finding the truth, it's living with it. Jonah nodded slowly, the words sinking in. Outside the wind rose, stirring the pines. Through the window Ethan could see the wooden sign down the road, K9 Ridge, its letters darkened by rain, the tribute weathering into permanence. Do people still come here? Jonah asked, following his gaze. Sometimes, Ethan said. Hikers, journalists, kids like you with questions. They always ask about the fire, the evidence, the trial. Nobody asks what happened after. What did happen after? Ethan smiled, almost to himself. The land healed, the people moved on, and the dog kept watch. Atlas lifted his head at the sound of his name, eyes soft but alert. Jonah crouched beside him, running a hand over the shepherd's fur. He's beautiful, he whispered. Yeah, Ethan said quietly. He's the best part of me that made it back. Jonah glanced at the old photographs again. You think there'll ever be a time when we don't need men like you, or dogs like him? Ethan thought for a long moment. Maybe one day, he said. But truth has a way of getting buried again. When it does, someone will need to dig it up. Someone who listens as well as he does. The student smiled, understanding now. He closed his notebook, stood, and offered his hand. Thank you, Mr. Cole, for the interview, and for what you did. Ethan shook it. You thank Atlas. He's the real journalist here. He just can't type. Jonah laughed, then stepped outside to take a few photos of the valley. Ethan watched from the doorway as the camera clicked. Frames of the ridge, the cabin, the sign. The kid was seeing history, but not the kind that filled textbooks. This was quieter, living, breathing, etched into the land and the scars of those who stayed. When Jonah's truck finally rumbled away, the afternoon settled back into its calm rhythm. Ethan poured the last of the coffee into his mug and sat on the porch beside Atlas. The shepherd stretched, then rested his head against Ethan's boot. Another story, told. Ethan murmured. Guess the truth keeps finding ways to stay alive. Atlas exhaled, eyes half closed, the golden light of dusk catching his fur. For a brief moment, Ethan imagined the ridge years from now. No cabin, no scars, just forest reclaiming everything. Maybe a child would pass by, see the sign, and ask who Atlas was. Maybe someone would tell them about a dog who never stopped guarding. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on Atlas's neck. Not haunted anymore, he said softly. Just home. And in that stillness, with the scent of pine drifting through the air and the sound of the wind threading through the valley, Ethan finally understood. What they had built wasn't just survival. It was legacy. The late afternoon sun cast a golden wash across Crow Hollow, soft and steady, as if the valley itself was breathing again. The new cabin stood quiet against the slope, its tin roof glowing beneath the sky. The scent of pine smoke drifted from the chimney, curling lazily upward, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called over the ridge. Ethan sat on the porch steps, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. Atlas lay stretched beside him, one paw crossed over the other, eyes half open, tail flicking occasionally against the boards. The dog's muzzle had grown grayer this year, but his gaze was as sharp as ever, always turned toward the mountains where everything had begun. The quiet was complete, except for the soft hum of the wind through the trees. Every so often, Ethan thought he heard the cabin creak, as though the place itself remembered. He spoke softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" Atlas's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Just that small sound, like an answer without words. It had been a year since the trial. The EPA's full report had changed laws across the state. Terracor's leadership was gone, its assets seized, and Crow Hollow officially designated a restoration zone. The water ran clear again, and the deer had returned to the stream. The town had begun to rebuild its trust in itself. And Ethan had learned to breathe. The sound of footsteps crunched on the gravel road. Ethan looked up as a small figure approached. A boy, maybe 10 years old, carrying a fishing rod and wearing boots too big for him. It was Charlie, the neighbor's kid from the valley below. "Hey, Mr. Cole," the boy called, waving. "Mom said I could come see the dog again." Ethan smiled and nodded. "He's right here. Just don't sneak up on him. He still thinks every squirrel's a saboteur." Charlie laughed, slowing as he reached the porch. Atlas lifted his head and sniffed the air. Recognizing the scent, he thumped his tail once against the wood. "Hi, Atlas," Charlie whispered, kneeling down beside him. "You remember me?" Atlas blinked, then gave a quiet huff of acknowledgement. The boy grinned like he'd been knighted. Ethan watched them in silence for a moment, the young and the old, both steady in the fading light. Then Charlie glanced up, curiosity flashing in his eyes. "My teacher said this place used to be haunted," he said. "Is that true?" Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Depends on what you mean by haunted." Charlie frowned. "Like ghosts?" "No," Ethan said. "Not by ghosts, by guilt. But we chased that out a long time ago." The boy tilted his head, thinking about it. "So, is it all safe now?" Ethan looked at Atlas, whose eyes were still locked on the horizon, as if watching something invisible beyond the tree line. "Mostly," he said quietly. Charlie followed his gaze to the mountains, where the snow peaks caught the last orange light. "Does he ever stop watching?" he asked. Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep, where memory and peace finally meet. Only when the truth is safe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them held still. The forest whispered, the sky dimmed, and the first stars began to prick through the fading blue. Charlie stood, brushing snow off his knees. "I'll tell everyone at school that Atlas saved the town," he said proudly. Ethan nodded. "You do that, but tell them he's still on duty, all right?" The boy grinned, gave Atlas one last pat, and jogged back down the road, his laughter echoing faintly through the trees. As the sound faded, Ethan turned to his old companion. "Guess the next generation's got the story now." Atlas didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, steady, patient, eternal. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of pine and the faint rustle of the creek below. The valley was quiet again. The sun dipped behind the ridge, leaving only the glow of the hearth inside the cabin and the rhythmic breathing of the shepherd beside him. Ethan leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath his weight, and whispered, "Rest easy, partner. You've earned it." But even as he said it, he knew Atlas wasn't resting. Not really. His ears stayed pricked toward the mountains, his eyes still scanning the distance, watching, guarding, always. The camera of life pulled back slowly, from the cabin to the ridge to the winding river that cut through the valley like a silver thread. On the edge of the road, the wooden sign caught the last flicker of twilight. Canine Ridge, in honor of Atlas, who never stopped guarding the truth. The screen of memory would fade to gold, the wind carrying the soft echo of a dog's bark across the hollow. Then words would appear as if written by the land itself. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. What's your story with a loyal pet? And beneath that, a quiet invitation. Subtle but sincere. Subscribe to German Shepherd Stories, where loyalty still speaks louder than words.